When I arrived at Camp Summit, I didn't expect much, just a summer of fun and new experiences. But then I saw him, Chris, the camp monitor, tall, confident, with skin that shimmered like the night sky. One glance, and my heart was no longer mine. What started as stolen glances and shy smiles turned into a secret romance under the stars. I thought I'd found something real until the night I saw another camper sneaking into his tent. What I uncovered shattered my world, and what I did next shocked everyone. Going to camp wasn't my idea. My mom insisted it would be good for me. A summer away from home, surrounded by nature and new faces. At 19, I had never been in a relationship or even understood what love really felt like. But the moment I arrived at Camp Summit, something inside me began to shift. The first day felt overwhelming. The smell of pine trees, the glimmer of the lake in the distance, and the excited chatter of campers created an atmosphere that was both foreign and exhilarating. I was trying to adjust when I saw him for the first time. Chris. He was standing near the dining hall, organizing some gear with an effortless confidence that made everyone stop and stare. Tall, muscular, with deep brown skin that gleamed under the sun, and a smile that seemed to hold the world in it. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't understand why. "You must be Ethan," he said, walking toward me with that disarming smile. His voice was deep but warm, as though he already knew how nervous I felt. I stammered a reply, barely able to meet his eyes, my shyness betraying me. He chuckled lightly, an easy laugh that sent a flutter through my chest. "Don't worry," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "We'll make sure you feel right at home." For the rest of the day, I couldn't get Chris out of my head. It was like he was everywhere, leading activities, helping campers with their tents, even shooting hoops with a group of kids by the court. Every time I saw him, my chest tightened, and I felt this strange magnetic pull toward him. Later that evening, just before lights out, I walked by the showers on my way back to my tent. That's when it happened. Chris stepped out, water dripping from his broad shoulders and down his sculpted chest. A towel hung loosely around his waist, clinging to his hips, and for a moment, he looked like something out of a dream. He caught me staring and smirked, his confidence radiating. "You good, Ethan?" he asked casually, his voice snapping me back to reality. I stammered something incoherent and practically ran back to my tent, my face burning with embarrassment. I spent the rest of the night replaying that moment in my head. What was this feeling? Why couldn't I stop thinking about him? I had never felt this way about anyone before. As the camp settled into silence, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent. Something about Chris had awakened something in me, something I didn't fully understand yet. But one thing was clear. This summer was going to be different. The next morning, the camp was already buzzing with activity when I woke up. The distant sound of someone hammering stakes into the ground and the chatter of campers filled the air. I stepped out of my tent, stretching, still groggy from a restless night. As I glanced across the field, I saw Chris by the lake, helping a group of kids adjust their fishing rods. He was wearing a tight black tank top, and every move he made seemed effortless, his muscles flexing as he gestured to the water. I tried not to stare, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. "Hey, Ethan," a voice called, snapping me out of my trance. It was Tyler, one of the guys I'd met the day before. He was cheerful and talkative, The kind of guy who could make friends in seconds. We're heading to the ropes course. Want to come? I hesitated, still unsure if I'd fit in here, but I nodded anyway, grateful for the distraction. As we walked toward the course, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder at Chris. He caught me looking once and flashed me a quick grin, his eyes lingering on me for just a second longer than I expected. My stomach flipped. Did he notice me? Was I just imagining it? I shook my head, trying to focus on Tyler's endless stream of conversation. The ropes course turned out to be more fun than I had anticipated. Balancing on wobbly planks and climbing through tangled nets left me feeling exhilarated. But no matter how much I tried to focus, Chris kept slipping into my thoughts. Every time I heard his voice in the distance or caught a glimpse of him through the trees, my chest tightened. It was like he was everywhere, and I couldn't escape the way he made me feel. Later that afternoon, I found myself by the lake again, sitting on the edge of the dock and dipping my feet into the water. The sun was warm on my skin, and for a moment, I let myself relax. That's when Chris appeared, walking down the dock with his usual confident stride. He was carrying a small cooler, his tank top now replaced with a simple white t-shirt that clung to his chest from the heat. He stopped a few feet away from me, his shadow falling over the water. "Enjoying the view?" he asked, his voice smooth and teasing. I felt my face flush and quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the ripples in the water. "Yeah, it's nice," I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled, setting the cooler down and sitting beside me, his legs dangling over the edge of the dock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the water lapping against the shore filled the silence between us. "You're quiet," Chris said finally, breaking the stillness. "Not a bad thing, though. It's kind of refreshing." I glanced at him, surprised. "I'm just not used to being around so many people," I admitted, my voice hesitant. Chris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. Camps can be overwhelming at first, but give it a little time. You'll find your place." His words were simple, but they carried a kindness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. For the first time, I found myself smiling back at him. "Thanks," I said, feeling a little braver. "Anytime," he replied, his grin widening. "You're not as invisible as you think, Ethan." The way he said my name sent a shiver through me, and I knew I'd remember this moment long after the summer was over. That night, as the campfire crackled and everyone gathered around for s'mores, I found myself stealing glances at Chris again. He was standing with a group of the other monitors, laughing at something one of them said. His laughter was infectious, his presence magnetic. I couldn't help but wonder if he noticed me watching him. At one point, his eyes met mine across the flames. For a brief second, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. He held my gaze, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. My breath caught, and I quickly looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. When I crawled into my sleeping bag later, the warmth of the fire still lingering on my skin, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. Chris's smile, his voice, the way he seemed to see through the walls I'd built around myself, it all felt too good to be real. But as I stared up at the stars through the small window of my tent, a new thought crept into my mind. Maybe this summer wasn't just about escaping my old life. Maybe it was about discovering something entirely new. And maybe, just maybe, Chris was the key to unlocking it. The next day started like any other at Camp Summit, bustling with activity, kids shouting excitedly, and the sound of tents being unzipped as the camp slowly came to life. But for me, it wasn't just another day. After the moments I'd shared with Chris the day before, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every glance, every word, every small smile felt like it held a deeper meaning. Was it all in my head? Or was there something between us? I spent the morning trying to distract myself by joining a group hike. The trail wound through thick forest, sunlight breaking through the trees in golden beams. I should have been enjoying the peace and quiet, but my thoughts kept drifting. Tyler, ever the talker, kept trying to engage me in conversation, but even he noticed something was off. "Ethan, you've been zoning out all morning," he teased, nudging my arm. "Let me guess. Camp Crush." I froze for a moment, my heart pounding. "What? No, of course not," I said, quickly, my voice a little too defensive. Tyler just laughed, brushing it off, but his words stuck with me. Was I that obvious? Could other people tell how I felt about Chris? By the time we returned to camp, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. As the group dispersed, I noticed Chris sitting on a bench near the volleyball court, scribbling something in a notebook. He looked so focused, his brow slightly furrowed, and for a moment, I hesitated. But then he looked up, catching my eye, and gestured for me to come over. "Hey, Ethan," he said, setting the notebook aside. "How was the hike?" "It was good," I replied, sitting down a little awkwardly beside him. "Tiring, though?" He laughed, his smile as warm as the midday sun. "That's the point. Builds character." He leaned back, stretching his long legs out in front of him. "So, are you settling in okay? You seemed a little out of it yesterday." His question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "I guess I'm just not used to being around so many people," I admitted finally. "It's a little overwhelming." Chris nodded, his expression softening. "I get that. I was the same way when I started working here. Took me a while to find my rhythm. But hey, you're doing fine, I can tell." His words sent a rush of warmth through me, and I found myself smiling despite my nerves. "Thanks," I said quietly. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that Chris saw something in me that no one else did. He made me feel different, like I mattered. And for someone who had spent most of his life feeling invisible, that was a big deal. That night, as the camp settled into its usual evening routine, I found myself lingering by the showers, hoping to catch another glimpse of Chris. It was a stupid, reckless thing to do, but I couldn't help myself. When he finally appeared, his skin glistening with water, the towel slung low around his hips, my breath hitched. He looked like a vision, his confidence radiating with every step. "You waiting for something, Ethan?" he asked, his voice teasing but not unkind. I felt my face heat up as I stumbled over my words, trying to come up with an excuse. I was just heading back to my tent," I said, finally, avoiding his gaze. Chris chuckled, his deep laugh sending a shiver down my spine. "Sure you were." "Don't stay out too late," he said, his tone playful but with a hint of something else. For a moment, it felt like he was inviting me into his world, daring me to take a step closer. As he walked away, I stood frozen in place, my heart racing. What was happening between us? Was it just my imagination, or was there something real? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Back in my tent, I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying every word, every look, every small interaction. Chris had become the center of my world, and it terrified me how much I wanted him. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something extraordinary, something that could change everything. And as the stars twinkled above the camp, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this summer slip away. Whatever was happening between me and Chris, I was going to find out, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of determination. My heart was still pounding from the night before. The image of Chris stepping out of the showers etched into my mind. I couldn't keep ignoring these feelings, no matter how confusing they were. I had spent most of my life holding back, afraid to take risks. But something about Chris made me want to be braver. He made me want to break free from my shell. The day's schedule was packed with activities, kayaking, archery, and team games that kept everyone busy. I caught glimpses of Chris throughout the day, but he was always surrounded by other campers or monitors, his attention elsewhere. Each time our eyes met, my stomach did a little flip, and I found myself wondering if he felt the same spark that I did. It wasn't until later in the afternoon, during free time, that I finally got a chance to talk to him alone. I was sitting by the edge of the lake, skipping stones across the water when he appeared behind me. "Mind if I join?" he asked, his voice soft and inviting. I nodded, trying to keep my face from betraying the excitement bubbling inside me. He sat down beside me, his presence warm and magnetic. "You're pretty good at that," he said, watching as one of my stones skipped 3 times before sinking. "Better than I ever was." I laughed nervously. "I've had a lot of practice. It's kind of my thing." Chris leaned back on his hands, gazing out at the water. "Everyone needs a thing, I guess. Mine's probably fixing stuff around camp. Keeps my hands busy." He glanced at me, his eyes warm and curious. "What about you? What keeps you busy, Ethan?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I guess I've never really figured that out. I'm just, kind of here." Chris nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening. "That's okay. Sometimes it takes a while to find your thing, and sometimes it just finds you when you're not looking." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was talking about more than just hobbies. For a moment, it felt like we were the only 2 people in the world, the lake stretching out before us like an endless horizon. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the water in shades of orange and gold, Chris stood up and held out a hand to help me up. "Come on," he said, his smile easy and inviting. "Let's head back before they send out a search party." I took his hand, my heart racing as his fingers wrapped around mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a turning point, like I was finally stepping into something I had been too afraid to face before. That night, as the campfire blazed and the group gathered for stories and songs, I couldn't stop stealing glances at Chris. He was sitting on the opposite side of the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. Every laugh, every smile, every word he spoke felt like it was meant for me, even though I knew it wasn't. When the fire died down and everyone began to drift back to their tents, I lingered, my mind racing with thoughts of what I wanted to say to him. As he walked past me on his way to his tent, he paused, his eyes meeting mine. "Good night, Ethan," he said, his voice low and full of something I couldn't quite place. Good night, I managed to reply, my voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, I felt a surge of courage I hadn't felt before. I couldn't keep holding back. I had to know if this connection was real. Hours later, long after the camp had fallen silent, I found myself standing outside his tent. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling, but I knew I couldn't turn back, like now. Taking a deep breath, I gently knocked on the side of the tent. Chris's voice came from inside, low and curious. Ethan, what are you doing here? I needed to talk to you, I said, my voice shaking. The tent flap rustled, and a moment later, he appeared, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. He was shirtless, his chest broad and glistening in the faint moonlight, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Come in, he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. The tent was small and warm, and the scent of him, earthy and clean, filled the air. I sat down on the edge of his sleeping bag, my heart racing as he sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. What's going on, Ethan? He asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I don't know how to say this, but I think I feel something for you, I admitted, finally, my voice barely above a whisper. And I don't know what to do about it. For a moment, Chris was silent, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his hand brushing against mine. You're not alone in this, he said softly, his eyes holding mine. But if we do this, it has to stay between us. No one else can know. His words sent a rush of relief and excitement through me, and I nodded, my heart soaring. As the night stretched on, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble, and for the first time, I let myself be vulnerable. What happened in that tent was something I would never forget. It was messy and new and overwhelming, but it was real. And as I lay beside Chris, his arm draped over me, I felt like I had finally found something I didn't even know I was searching for. But deep down, I also knew that secrets like ours could never stay hidden for long. The next morning, the weight of the previous night sat heavily on my chest. I couldn't look at Chris during breakfast without my stomach churning. He laughed and joked with everyone, completely unaware of what I'd seen or what I planned to do. I spent the day avoiding him, anger bubbling under the surface every time I caught a glimpse of him and Derek. They weren't even subtle about it. Every shared glance, every casual touch felt like a knife twisting deeper into my heart. How could he be so careless after everything we'd shared? That evening, while the campers gathered for dinner, I made my move. The video I'd recorded sat in my phone, waiting. I uploaded it anonymously to the camp's group chat, my hands trembling as I pressed send. Within minutes, murmurs spread like wildfire. Heads turned. Phones were passed around and whispers filled the air. Chris's face fell the moment he realized something was wrong. His confident demeanor crumbled as people began to confront him, their voices rising in anger and disbelief. Chris cornered me later that night, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. Ethan, what the hell did you do? He demanded, his voice low but trembling. I met his gaze, my own eyes brimming with unshed tears. I trusted you, I said, my voice breaking. I thought we had something real and you threw it away for him. Chris's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. It's not what you think. Don't lie to me, I snapped, cutting him off. I saw it. I felt it. And now, so does everyone else. The camp exploded with tension in the days that followed. Chris was pulled aside by the camp director, his future hanging in the balance. Derek tried to defend him, but the damage was already done. Everyone knew what had happened, and no one was willing to look the other way. As for me, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Exposing Chris had felt like the only way to reclaim my dignity, but it didn't erase the pain of his betrayal. I avoided him as much as possible, but every time our paths crossed, his eyes were filled with unspoken words that I didn't care to hear. On the last day of camp, Chris approached me one final time. "Ethan," he began, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I'm sorry for everything." I stared at him, my emotions a tangle of hurt and anger. "I don't need your apology, Chris. I needed your honesty, and you couldn't give me that." He nodded, his expression heavy with guilt. "I hope one day you can forgive me," he said quietly before walking away, leaving me with nothing but memories of what could have been. As the bus pulled away from Camp Summit, I stared out the window, the events of the summer replaying in my mind. Chris had broken my heart, but he had also taught me something important. I deserved love that was open and honest, not hidden in the shadows. I didn't know what the future held, but as the camp faded into the distance, I felt a strange sense of relief. This chapter of my life was over, and I was ready to move forward, stronger, wiser, and ready to find someone who wouldn't be afraid to love me out in the open. Hey, did you like the story? Be honest. So tell me, what did you think of today's story? Did it make your heart race? Or maybe even break it a little? I want to know your real opinion. How would you rate this story from 1 to 10? Drop your honest rating in the comments below. I'm dying to hear what you think. And while you're there, let's get to know each other. Leave your name in the comments. And if someone likes your comment, it means they're interested in you. Let's turn this comment section into a place to connect and share some love. Who knows? Maybe you'll make a new friend or something more. I can't wait to read your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation going down below.